Hi everyone, and welcome to the Star Wars Reading Club book review of Star Wars The Last Jedi by Jason Fry, which of course is the Episode 8 novelization. Before we get into this week's giveaways and really jump into the novel, I just want to say that it's great to be able to do weekly reviews once again here on the channel of different Star Wars novels and comics. I checked and I'm pretty sure that the last review we did, as far as novels or comics go, was for Guardians of the Whills, which was probably over a year ago at this point. So I'm really happy to be able to get back to these reviews, primarily because of the discussion that always takes place around them. But it's also gonna let me start doing giveaways of the materials that we review as well. But to start, maybe in case you didn't see the announcement video that I did last week, every week, Mondays from here on till the rest of the year, we're going to be doing a review of different novels and comics, and each month, as voted on by the patrons of the channel, we're going to get to one canon novel, one Legends novel, one canon comic, and one Legends comic. So we're going to hit a wide range of materials, and like I said, it's really good to be able to get some reviews going again here on the channel. But also, as I mentioned, it'll also let us do some giveaways. And with that said, let's get to our first giveaways for this week here. And basically, if you didn't see the announcement video, we're going to be giving away at least 2 copies every week of the material that we review. One copy is going to be for the entire audience of Star Wars Reading Club. Basically, all you have to do is just be on the lookout for a question at the beginning of a particular video, and then just answer that question in the comment section down below. So that'll be one copy, and then a second copy will be exclusively for the Patreon supporters of the channel. But with this week's giveaway, we had, inclusive of patrons, we had almost 300 participants, which was really awesome to see. We had a lot of people jump in and give who their favorite Jedi was, so that was awesome to see, and I can't thank you guys enough for your participation. But with our first winner, and this one was for the entire audience of Star Wars Reading Club, our first winner is Hunter Y. So big congratulations to Hunter, who let me know who his favorite Jedi was in the comments section. Our second winner, which is our first Patreon winner here, is Michael. So congratulations to Michael, and again, thank you very much for your support over on Patreon. And our third winner, again to a Patreon supporter of the channel, is Ben L., a longtime supporter like so many of you guys out there. So big congratulations to our 3 winners, and a really big thank you to all of the participants this week. What I'll do is for Hunter, I'll send you a message right here on YouTube, so just take a look at your inbox. And for our 2 Patreon winners, I'll send you guys a message over on Patreon just to let you guys know how to give me your mailing address so I can mail out the hardcover copies of the novelization. But again, thanks so much for everyone who participated. And what I'll do is we'll let our winners have until next Thursday to get back to me. If for whatever reason, if I don't hear back, then we'll just give away more copies down the road here. But again, congratulations to our 3 winners, and thanks for participating, everybody. We're going to do the exact same thing again this week, and I'll let you know that next week we're going to be reviewing Star Wars Lando, which is the 2015 canon comic, which I've already read at this point twice, and have made already quite a bit of notes on, and I think you guys are going to enjoy it. So be on the lookout for this week of how to win yourself a copy of Star Wars Lando. Like we did last week, we'll just leave a question at the beginning of 2 videos, and all you have to do is answer it in the comment section down below to participate. But again, thank you so much for everyone who participated, and congratulations to our 3 winners. And with that, let's jump right into our review of The Last Jedi novelization. Maybe to start, I'll just say this was the first novel that I read from Jason Fry, and I maybe should put it out there as well. I've had this sitting on my shelf for a while now, so I haven't read it until it was time to do the review here. But I did cheat, and I did go through the novel and read basically all of the Luke and Rey parts. But other than that, this was the first time that I had read the novel, and I have to say, I did a pretty good job of staying away from a lot of the opinions and what people thought of the novel, particularly as it related to the movie. So I went in completely not really knowing what to expect and not really having too many expectations. I was hoping that it would make the movie better in some ways, but nonetheless, all of that aside, I do have to say that I really enjoyed this novelization. If we're going to go this way, I would definitely say that no matter what you thought about Episode 8, the movie, I would definitely recommend the novelization. And of course, that's coming too, I should just note, from a huge fan of novelizations in general. And someone who really hasn't ever been done wrong when it comes to novelizations for the Star Wars franchise. But I don't get to read too many novelizations. The only novelizations I've really read now for Star Wars are the Revenge of the Sith novelization, which was great. That's one of my favorite novels in general. And then now this one. But nonetheless, I flipped through Rogue One and also the other two prequel movies. I flipped through those novelizations enough where it feels like I read them. So it feels like I've read more novelizations than I have. But like I said, I'm a huge novelization fan, and I really think that this one adds quite a bit to the movie. And maybe before we jump into some different parts of the novel here, I should just give my philosophy on how I think maybe I'll approach the movie now having read the novelization. It definitely made the movie better for me and gave some much needed insights where I was hoping that we would get them. But with that said, and again, too, it wasn't perfect. We didn't get every little thing that I was hoping for, but I don't think that I'll be merging the two, for example. It definitely made the movie better, but I'm still somebody who thinks that the movie has to stand on its own. I've explained this a couple of times on different Patreon streams and Twitch streams. The movie has to stand for itself, and I would kind of feel obnoxious if whenever somebody brought up a critique or a question of the movie Episode 8 to start bringing in materials from the novelization here. And that applies to the guides as well. For example, if I was to take all of the information that we learned from the novelization and the guides, I could make a pretty good outline for different criticisms, I feel like, of the movie. But do you really want to be the guy who's starting to point to all this lore material and different information from the Art of Guide or the visual dictionaries or even this novelization here? So I think as far as my philosophy, I am going to treat them all sort of individually on their own basis, but I do have to say that it really made the movie better for me, just in the sense that it gave a lot of much needed insight where I was hoping that it would be. We got a lot of new scenes as well, and it's almost disappointing just how great a lot of these deleted scenes were. But just in terms of new scenes, I'm just going to read the first paragraph on the opening flap, which really gives a good indication on what you're going to get with this novelization. But it says, written with input from director Rian Johnson, this thrilling adaptation of Star Wars The Last Jedi expands on the film to include scenes from alternate versions of the script and other additional content. So I think that that's a good way of putting it. That's basically exactly what you get. The deleted scenes, though, and we'll get into a bunch of them here in a moment, but some of the deleted scenes, I feel like if they were put into the movie, it would have impacted and changed the movie quite a bit. I think, and we'll get to them when we get to those characters and those parts of the story, but there was 3 of them which I think were integral parts to different characters and to the story overall that unfortunately didn't make it into the movie, which I think would have helped to really breathe a lot of emotion into some characters that may have fell flat, but also just to give a much better indication on things for Luke as well. So you do get a lot of new scenes, but if you've read, for example, the Episode 3 novelization, it's not to that extent. The Revenge of the Sith novelization feels in a lot of ways like the same movie, of course, but it's just it blew me away in just how not different it was from the movie, but it was really a very different accompanying work. This doesn't go to that extent, but I do feel that there's a lot of similarities between the Episode 8 novelization and the Episode 3 novelization. I would just also mention before we start getting into some of the characters and some of my favorite new information and scenes, I didn't watch the film after reading the novel. My intention was to watch Episode 8 again right after reading the book, but I haven't seen it for months now, And I think that it's better to do the review here just to let the novel stand on its own, like I was saying before, and to just let the novel speak for itself and not do a bunch of comparisons with the movie, just to kind of let it kind of work with the movie on this review here. So I did intend to watch episode 8 again. It has been a few months at this point, and I've really only seen it like 4 or 5 times. So I hope it doesn't impact it too much in terms of this review. But I thought it was best to not watch the film immediately after reading the novel. But we're going to jump into the prelude here, but I will just say, if we're keeping it spoiler-free at the beginning here, I did get a significant sense through the novel that there was a lot more going on with Luke and the Force, for example, and also like Rey and Acto, and Kylo as well with Rey. The novel gives a sense that there was a lot more going on that I didn't pick up from the film right away, but which I did get from the novel. So let's jump right into that here. And I think now that we're getting into the novel, I think the place to start is with the prelude. I was going to start with Luke, Rey, and Acto, but it might get a little bit weird when we get to those parts. I have to admit, I have a bunch of theories and different interpretations of the novel, but let's hold off on that. And maybe I will just state too that a lot of this is kind of raw for me at this point. I'm still putting my thoughts together. They'll be developed better in videos down the road, but nonetheless, let's start with the prelude, which I thought was absolutely fascinating and really was like the perfect opening to I was going to say the movie, to the novel here, but again, this is one of those which I'm assuming deleted scenes that I don't know if they shot it or how far it got off the page, but nonetheless, this was a fascinating scene that I think would have been great in the movie. And basically what it was, if you have read the novel too, let me know what your interpretation of this prelude is, because I've been jumping around with a bunch of them at this point. But basically what we're looking at is it's Luke on Tatooine, decades after the events of A New Hope. I want to say it's pretty much a mirror of the time of him on Acto, because it's an alternative path for Luke, but it's a dream that he's having while on Acto. So I want to say that it's around the same time, but basically it's showing Luke really by happenstance what would have happened if the droids, C-3PO and R2, fell back into the hands of the Empire, and Luke never joined Obi-Wan or the rebellion. And the thing that I liked about it too is it was kind of just by happenstance. Luke remembers it just kind of unfolding as almost like not really that important. It was just an event that happened, something to the effect of stormtroopers coming to get the droids, Obi-Wan appearing, and then just really never hearing how it ended. He just went on with his life. So we see Luke decades later, and I will just say too that the outcome for the galaxy was absolutely terrible. Like, we learned that Leia was executed, and not only Alderaan, but also Mon Cala and Chandrila were destroyed by the Death Star, which of course would have been the home planets of Admiral Akbar and also Mon Mothma. When I read that part, I gasped, thinking how amazing that was to add into the novelization. So you have Leia executed, 3 planets are destroyed, but as awful as it was for the galaxy at large, because you still had the Empire at this point, many decades later, there was like a relative peace for Luke. He seemed to be doing okay. He had just taken over the Lars homestead. He had a wife named Cammy, and there was relative peace for him in the sense that he wasn't bothered by the Empire. The whole part of the prelude was that he thought he had seen a Star Destroyer, and just how, uncharacteristic it was that the Empire would be on Tatooine. So there was relative peace for him, but there was still that feeling for Luke that he never got off Tatooine. He was just a simple farmer on Tatooine still, and he never really got off Tatooine to have that great adventure. So my interpretation of is, again, just sets the stage for what Luke is really trying to do on Acto, but unsuccessfully, and really isn't the true character of Luke. I like that they positioned in Luke's mind, because it was a dream, that really what he was doing on Acto was akin to what his dream was telling him on Tatooine. Like, it was a relative peace, but there was still an awful outcome for the galaxy. There was still something to be done where he could have got involved at that point. But nonetheless, interpretations aside, it was just a really fascinating way to start off the novelization. I knew, even though I avoided the novel and different opinions, I knew that there was going to be this prelude, and in particular that Luke would have a wife. I didn't know that it would be a dream that he had of an alternative path. I didn't know if it was a vision or what it was going to be. I really liked this prelude. I thought that it was fascinating and really set the stage for the rest of the novel. I think it probably just boils down to a mirror of what Luke was trying to do on Acto. But this is one of those things, if you've read the novelization, I would really love to hear what everyone else thought about this prelude as well. But personally, I think that prelude was just the perfect way to kick off the novel and really set the stage for what was going to become of Luke for the rest of the novel. And with that said, I think it is time now to talk a bit about Luke Skywalker. And really, I'll say this. I'll say that it's the same story. So really, if you didn't enjoy the story from the movie, then the novel, again, too, isn't going to change or impact everything for you. But it really, I have to say, and being fully honest, as somebody who went in to the movie, that is, with a number of expectations for Luke and really did his best to try to not let them impact his overall view of Episode 8, I can't say how much I really enjoyed the information that we got from the novelization. I looked at Luke in a totally different light than I did from the movie. And really, I did miss a lot from the movie, I have to say. A lot of it probably my own fault. And maybe some of it, again, just didn't connect well through the film for whatever reason. It just wasn't clear on what exactly was happening. And I have to admit, I haven't seen the film a number of times or really sat through and tried to analyze it completely. I've stayed away from it quite a bit now for the last couple of months. And at this point, I think it's time to jump back in with Luke. But just for example, I didn't remember. My whole thing going in was I thought that Luke was going to see that he was going to fully understand that the Jedi ways were over at that point, weren't going to work, were impractical, and then he was going to come up with a new way with Rey, and then that was going to be the ending of the film. But I have to say, I really didn't quite pick up in the film just how much, I don't want to say anti-Jedi, but just how much he understood that, yes, the Jedi needed to end. And of course, he says that. It's in the film, he says that. But again, it doesn't come across on just how much new stuff he understood as well. He knew the Jedi had to end, but was that just out of his own anger towards the Order, his own anger towards himself? But the novel really puts it forth. Even with his lessons from Rey, where he agrees to teach her, he tells her the Force isn't something that belongs to the Jedi alone. So again, that's really separating the Force and the Jedi. I really like that. And then the second lesson, I think, was something to the effect of the Jedi hubris is what led to the rise of Sidious and the failed legacy of the Jedi Order. So again, too, you're seeing first that there's almost a supremacy of the Force over the Jedi. It's not like the Jedi have a monopoly on the Force, so you don't have to become a Jedi nonetheless. And also, too, that the Jedi were acting wrong, and it was exactly their hubris and the actions that they were taking that led to the rise of the dark side. So all of that comes across a lot better in the novelization, I have to say. And I do think that Luke knew more than I gave him credit for in the film. And I also think, as we'll see, he came to basically a full conclusion that a lot of people have said to me, are you disappointed perhaps with the whole balance connection? Luke didn't really get there. I'm not sure that he didn't at this point, I have to admit. Maybe that's just my own hubris and misinterpretation of it all, but I'm not sure that he doesn't get there by the end of the film. The novel was just so fascinating. And truly, in the sense, in talking about Luke, I don't think that you can separate him from Acto at this point. And even with Rey, so I think what I'll do is I'll look at all of them in combination here, but I don't think you can understand what happens with Luke in Episode 8 without fully understanding what Acto is. And I have to say that at this point, I'm really fascinated with Acto. I went down that road right after the film. I did a video connecting a lot of similarities between Acto and Mortis. And I have to say that even right now, as much as I love Mortis, Mortis is just one of those planets that's really fascinating to me. My top 2 planets right now are Acto and Jeddah. And of course, Jeddah is a moon, but nonetheless, those 2 planets really have my attention at this point. And just in terms of Acto, it's more so in the visual guides as well. This kind of started from the visual guides, just connecting how important the Temple Island was. But even the novel here, and this is stuff that I wish came across a lot better in the movie, but the novelization gives a really good impression that there's a lot going on with Acto, kind of in terms of more so the Force and how that impacts Luke. But just getting into it, something that I had kind of forgotten about as well, but Acto's location within the unknown regions is very important, I think, at this point. We'll get to it more when we talk about Snoke, but it appears in some of the guides, but most importantly, in the Aftermath trilogy, the whole sense that Palpatine was really focused on getting into the unknown regions, on blazing a path to get the Empire into the unknown regions for 2 reasons, and we'll talk about this more with Snoke, but basically so that if the Empire fails, the Remnant can go to the unknown regions and grow there. But then also too, he sensed something was greater within the unknown regions. And I think that, I'll say it now, but we'll get into it when we talk about Snoke. Snoke alludes that there's a connection to the idea that the ancient faith and the early beliefs of the Sith and Jedi emerged from the unknown regions, which I love. That's really good stuff and connects well to the Aftermath trilogy. So this whole connection to the unknown regions, which isn't too unfamiliar. Like, for example, we know from the guides, and I've seen a lot of people discussing this as well, that Acto was with the ancient mosaic, the location of like the first Jedi temple, but we also see the ancient mosaic of the prime Jedi, like the first Jedi, and just the whole idea of balance that surrounded that. So it's not like we don't know that the Jedi beliefs originate from Acto, but just the connection with the unknown regions is extremely important as presented through the novelization. Also too, and this is really where I get my ideas back to the whole concept of balance, or at least in the sense of where Luke was intending to take the Jedi Order, and then perhaps still intends and is going to show Rey where to go in Episode 9. But just in terms of Acto as well, the novelization makes it clear that specifically the Temple Island is the key to Acto, and even then, the temple itself, the first Jedi temple on Temple Island, was a concentration of light, and it's described as, quote, a powerful, blinding light in the Force. But the thing is, too, is the key, and we see this in the film when Luke is taking Rey through her first lessons. There's the powerful, blinding light in the Force, but there's also darkness, and as it said, powerful darkness, which is just as powerful as the blinding light from the temple. And that's manifested, of course, in the mirror cave on Temple Island that we see Rey go into. So my interpretation, as it's presented in the novel, at least as it applies to Acto, is I think that yes, Acto, but more so Temple Island, is really the manifestation of the true way in which a Jedi should exist. And that's basically within a found balance between light and dark. Like, that's where the first Jedi temple exists. It exists on an island that has blinding powerful light, but also has the exact opposite, powerful darkness to the opposite extent. And going into the film, I thought that Luke would eventually find a balanced approach, in the sense that previously the Jedi would use the light and reject the dark, and the Sith would do the opposite. They would use the dark and reject the light. I thought that Luke was going to find a true a third way and kind of use whatever the balanced approach was, whether it was a combination of both of them or if it was just the Force in its totality. But as it's presented in the novel, I've changed that interpretation around quite a bit. Like right now, I don't think that balance is something that you act with, and I don't think that you use the balanced approach. I think that really what you learn from Acto, and really what you see later in the actions of Luke and Rey is that balance is something that a true Jedi achieves, and it's just an understanding and a recognition that light and dark exists, and a Jedi has to learn to live within the reality that is light and dark around them. And really just it's really just the totality of the Force. The Force exists as light and dark, and a Jedi has to accept that reality. So I don't think that it's something that you use necessarily. You don't use the balance. Like, for example, Force abilities, you have to use the light as a Jedi would teach it, or use the dark as a Sith would teach it. I think more so the focus is inner for at least these first Jedi and whatever their initial beliefs were on Acto. Like, for example, that Prime Jedi mosaic is a good example of it. They're not using the light or they're not using the dark. They're in balance within a reality, and that temple is really the true manifestation of it. A reality that wherein both light and dark exists. So a Jedi has to find themselves and be okay within that balance. So that's how I look at Luke at this point within Acto. And really, I think Acto is kind of the key to the whole thing as well. I put so much into Acto because there are numerous points in the novel. For example, right before Rey confronts Luke for the final time on Acto about the reality that happened with Ben Solo, it says that like Luke felt the world of Acto flood back into him just before he was confronted. So it is an aspect as well where it's not just the Force, but it was the Force as it existed on Acto. And I did see it labeled like that a number of times throughout the novel. So there was also at the very end, it says that, like, it makes a note that it's not the Force. When Luke ends his Force ability and comes back from Crate, it doesn't say that the Force is wild and alive when Luke returns to Acto. It says that the island is alive and wild. And at that point, Luke hears a voice and sees the suns. So it really manifests like Acto is the key. Like the island is alive and it's what's going within him, not necessarily just the Force. So I do think that there is something that separates Acto on its own and really is like a teaching mechanism for Jedi. And I think that the best scene that really ties this all together and really sets Acto apart and sets it as like this teaching area for Jedi is just the second to last, the penultimate scene of the novel, which is, I don't know if it's a deleted scene or just part of the script or how far it went, because I don't know if you could show this type of a scene in the movie. This is like made for novelization, which is why I love novelizations so much. But it's the penultimate scene. It happens right before Broom Boy at the end, but it's a scene from the point of view of the caretakers. And basically what they're doing is it's post Luke, becoming a Force ghost, if that's indeed what happened. But basically after he leaves the island. So it's in the aftermath of basically Luke leaving the island, as well as Rey too at that point, of course. But we see from the caretaker's perspective just that they refer to people like Luke and Rey who come to the island as outsiders. And sometimes, as it's mentioned, sometimes you have no outsiders for decades or centuries, and sometimes there's many that come at the same time. And for the outsiders, some of them are kind, and sometimes they're crazy. But nonetheless, the important part is that the caretakers recognized, one, that Luke brought back the artifacts that had been taken from the island a long time before that, which of course references the books, which I really loved because I didn't know exactly how to treat them. If those were books that Luke found in his journey after episode 6, and then he brought them to the island, and they were truly the original Jedi texts that originated from the island. So now it's great we have confirmation that they are, which I think is really important for why they called out to Rey, and then also why they're in her possession now at this point. But even more important than that, again, looking just at Acto as an area wherein Luke found true knowledge on what his true purpose was, and just treating Acto as this place that was a teaching area for Jedi that promoted that they had to find balance upon the island, which really was, again, the manifestation of strong light and strong dark, and a Jedi couldn't ignore either of them. But just in this scene, it said that the caretakers recognized that Luke was gone and wondered if he either 1, went mad and threw himself from the edge of the cliff, or 2, if he, quote, surrendered himself and became shadow, dispersing into the light and dark from which all had been created. So I love that. That was a really good part to put in the novelization, I think, at this point. It said that the caretakers wondered that because their songs, so their songs of what's been carried down over the years, of what's happened to these outsiders, it said that the paths, both paths were taken at certain points by different outsiders. So some people kind of went crazy and jumped off the ledge into the water, but others had also surrendered themselves to shadow and entered the light and dark from which all had been created. So I think that that's a really good metaphor, that there was some Jedi who go to the island, recognize it as a strong manifestation of light and dark, and then they either find balance like the ancient mosaic does with the Jedi Prime sitting within the light and dark, and then they surrender themselves to it, which is an acceptance of that balance, and that really they have to surrender themselves to the Force in its totality. But others Jedi, other outsiders, can't really handle that balance. And sometimes it drives them mad. And sometimes, maybe they can't accept the Force, where there's the reality that both light and dark exists and you have to find a balance between it. Or maybe they just can't find a balance and it drives them crazy. And of course, there's also the third option where people just kind of come and go and neither path is taken. But I do think that this scene really defines what happens to Luke. I think that it's a symbol that he really gave himself to the Force as it existed on Ahch-To and gave himself to the light and dark. And the fact that it's done through the point of view of the caretakers was really great. The visual guides goes into great details on the caretakers, and really is where I pulled a lot of the initial light and dark aspects of Ahch-To, which really connected well to Mortis. But nonetheless, this was a great scene. I don't know if it was a deleted scene or if it was ever intended to go into the movie, because again, I don't know how they could have shot it. It would have had to have been subtitled. It was very well done as just an internal monologue, but I do like it as well because it connects, just going back to Luke for a second. It's described very well in the scene with Luke and Leia on Crate, but it alludes to the fact like Leia can see within Luke, and this is the actual quote, that Luke had a knowledge that was vast and deep and strange, but also comforting, and it had changed him, remade him utterly. So there is a sense that it's not the same Luke at any point that Leia knew him, at least. So I would say at any point in like the Star Wars saga at this point, Luke is completely different by the end of the movie. And I think, having read the novel and maybe pulling parts out of that, I should probably watch the movie again just to see an interpretation that could be there. But I think it has to do with something with Ahch-To. I think it's, again, when Ahch-To sort of re-enters him and reconnects with the cosmic force upon Ahch-To, I think that that's all part of it. The knowledge aspect connects very well to what Snoke was alluding to within the unknown regions, and also within the wisdom of Luke going to Ahch-To specifically. So I think that it's something with Luke. I think that the whole combination of Luke and Ahch-To and Rey, even at this point too, is extremely fascinating. And really, Rey learns the whole lesson of it as well. She's not on Ahch-To at the point where a lot of this is happening, like for example where we get these final scenes and the description of Luke and Leia, but it manifests with Rey a little bit differently too, because we did learn, I mean, it's assumed after she and her and Kylo were fighting over Anakin's lightsaber, and then there's the collision of the Raddus with the Supremacy, we see that like Rey remembers back to having awoke first and then getting into the exact same position that Luke was at his Jedi temple, standing over Kylo, having the ability to strike him down and kill him. But the interesting point is that Rey learns from the error of Luke, and as the novel states it, she doesn't think that he can be redeemed, which I think is important. And we'll probably get into that when we discuss Kylo here in a second. But she doesn't think that he can be redeemed, and she notices really interestingly that she was incorrect, that her she foresaw that he would reject Snoke, but she interpreted that as him rejecting the dark side. So she knows that she was wrong about that. She misinterpreted that reading of events. But the reason why she doesn't kill Kylo, and the key to it is that she sees herself and Kylo as instruments of the Force, and thus it would be wrong to kill Kylo because the Force wasn't necessarily done with him. So, I mean, it is what it is. Some people might not like that understanding, but as it connects to all of this, the supremacy of the Force, a true Jedi acting to maintain the balance and really being a vessel and instrument of the Force itself, I think that there's something beautiful in that. Again, too, it really, of course, tongue-in-cheek, it really sets up for a good episode 9, but I think that it makes sense. Again, too, it's Rey not following the light and destroying the darkness. It's giving herself over to the Force and really distancing herself from the old ways of the Jedi. In really a lot of ways, it perfectly connects with what Luke was teaching her with her lessons, but then also too with what seemingly Luke would ultimately learn, because he basically does the same thing as well. So I think that the combination of Luke, Acto, and Rey right now are the most fascinating for me. A lot of these thoughts, like I said, they're going to have to be developed better in videos down the road. I have at least like half a dozen that I want to touch on at this point, but I think we'll leave that there. I'm just looking to see if there's anything else that I want to touch on. There was a couple more deleted scenes that I think were important in this regard, but as it applies in its totality, like right now, I'm really focused on Acto. I was the same way after Jeddah when Rogue One came out, but I do think that the learning, Acto was sort of like a learning mechanism for Luke and Rey is very important. It was something that I really wasn't focused on. I was more interested in the dichotomy of Luke and Rey themselves. But I think once you apply this like original Jedi temple and that planet, and specifically Temple Island itself, I think that's where you get into some really interesting aspects with Luke and Rey in the movie. I will just say too, just now that we're on the topic of Rey, again, too, it's the same story, so it's not too much different from Rey, but we did, just in regards to those aspects alone, where I see Rey as kind of learning from Luke, I do think that Luke will have an important role to play in Episode 9 now, whereas I might not have thought that too strongly before. But we did see at least interesting scenes where, like, we learned why Rey was so powerful on Starkiller Base, why she was able to go head-to-head with Kylo so easily. People might not accept it, but the novelization does touch on the fact that when Kylo was going through her mind, she was able to go through his mind as well, but almost in the sense of like she was going through computer files. She was able to access like the areas of his brain where his training resided. And so she could see the powers that he had, and then the novelization states something to the effect of she instinctively knew how to access his powers. So again, people might not accept it. I'm interested to see what you guys think about that explanation, but I mean, that does apply something to the whole thing as it applies to, Rey as this Mary Sue. I think this goes back to her being perhaps a favored vessel of the cosmic force like Anakin and Luke are, as it's described in the novel. So there's a lot of moving parts, but I did think that was at least an interesting part to include in the novelization. The part in the mirror cave too, I'll just say this quickly before we move on to some of the other characters. The Rey aspect in the mirror cave, I think, was done much better in the novelization. It happened very quickly, and it was over just as fast. She goes into the cave, I think it's like a paragraph or two, and then she sees herself in the reflection, and then she goes right to Kylo immediately. So it doesn't linger, it doesn't stretch it out, and it just kind of goes through it. She looks for the answer. She doesn't get the answer she wants, or which she interprets that she doesn't want, but it's over very quickly. And I think that those scenes happening quickly was a little bit better as applied in the novelization than the movie. But overall, like I said, I'm kind of back on my line of thought with what's going to happen with Luke. At this point, I'm not sure I'm giving up everything I thought before. The novelization kind of like reignited a lot of old ideas that I had. but then have kind of just redefined them in the sense of applying acto to the whole equation as well. But let's move on to some of the other characters as well in the novelization. We'll just quickly hit on Finn, Rose, Leia, and Poe, because I really want to get to Kylo and Snoke, and maybe even a bit of Hux as well. I have to say, Finn and Rose were much better overall in the novelization, and I think the key to Rose is they included a lot at the beginning and a lot of key scenes with her and her sister Paige. There was a lot of elements at the beginning of the novel with them that really breathed a lot of emotion and spirit into Rose as a character. It really, of course, it influenced how I saw Rose kind of throughout the whole novel, but it really gave a lot more gravity to that initial bombing run. I've talked to a lot of people who, you know, the initial action scene, the evacuation, I enjoyed it overall, but I do see how people really didn't quite walk away from it feeling the same way as, for example, the evacuation of Hoth. I understood that, but with the addition of these Rose and Paige scenes, man, they really added a lot of weight to just that initial bombing run, and then also just for the character of Rose overall. So I really liked it. I liked the scenes that we got from Rose and Paige. Again, I won't say too much more about them, but I also think that just in regards to Finn, the arc for Finn, I mean, it's the same arc, so it's not anything different from the movie. And for me, this is why novelizations are so great. I just think that it was better, not presented, but you could really see the change in Finn, not just from episode 8, but really just him from 7 to 8, but then, just from the beginning of 7 all the way to the end of 8. So that whole arc that he goes through of wanting to flee the First Order and just kind of disappear, and then really doing what he needs to save Rey. It's presented in the novel quite a bit at the beginning that he's not interested in joining the Resistance. He just wants to find Rey and then save them both, and then hopefully they could go off somewhere into the Outer Rim. That's how Finn's looking at it. But by the end, again too, when he's on that suicide run to the cannon, the miniaturized Death Star tech, like he's a warrior for the Resistance at that point. He's doing whatever he can to stop the First Order. It's not Finn running away from the First Order. He's really just turned into like a mini Leia at that point too. Like he'll do whatever he can to save his friends and stop the First Order. So I just think that it was well done for both of those characters, Finn and Rose. There's really not too much to say about Leia and Poe either. Just in terms of Leia, I do like that it was presented at numerous times that she was viewed amongst the galaxy at least as this cult of personality and warmonger, which really tied in well to really how she's been presented in some of this era material, like in the novel Bloodline, for example. That really came across, and it comes across too in the Poe Dameron comics, so I'm glad that they included that. The scene where I should mention too, just the scene where she floats back to the Raddus. Like the scene with Rey in the Mirror Cave, it was done very quickly, and in my opinion, it was you wouldn't have remembered it. It's where it stands out in the film. It's something that's remembered. It's not really a memorable scene in the novel, in so much as it's just Leia, rescuing herself to that extent. So, same thing. It's like a paragraph maybe. And then she's back on board the Raddus. And it's almost even done better, too, because you get her internal monologue where she was willing to give up at that point, too. And you wouldn't almost blame her at that point either because she had lost so much. But the Raddus scene with her floating back, much better in the novelization. I should just mention that. The most painful scene, though, too, was with her and Chewbacca at the end, where I should mention, too, there was the deleted scene, I think, of her giving Han a funeral just before they're about to evacuate the car. But that scene was okay, in my opinion, the funeral scene. The key scene with Leia, which was great, was the scene with her and Chewbacca aboard the Falcon at the end. Oh, man, that was like she finally had a moment to process everything that happened. And realize at that point that she lost Luke, Han, Ben was lost at that point as well, turned to Kylo. And then like it goes through all these nostalgic moments from A New Hope, where like the first meeting she had with Chewbacca and then them fleeing from the Death Star, just all that. That was probably the heaviest scene, I think. And just a great Leia scene overall. But not too much to say about Leia, really. Same thing with Poe. Poe was just the exact same from the movie. What I really had my fingers crossed was for Poe. I really wanted to see him deal with the loss of the Cobalt Squadron, the bomber squadron, which really kind of comes down on him. I think it was 8 ships, and I'm not sure exactly how many are in one of those flying fortresses, but like, let's say it's 20 people. Really, at the end of the day, the loss of those 20 people are on him. And I thought that there was the potential, at least, for a good scene written by Jason Fry where he could have looked at Rose and maybe humanized that decision on his part to some extent, and really thought that, oof, like that decision I made, like a very rash decision, when it was stressed even more in the novelization. Like Leia and Akbar were kind of furious at him for not evacuating at that point and continuing on the bombing run. Like, yes, they took out a dreadnought, but there was also real world consequences. And I think that they could have written a scene where Poe looked at Rose and then it kind of hit him at that point because it led to the loss of her sister. But you never got that. And it was basically just the gung-ho warrior Poe that you got in the movie. So there's not too much to be said about Poe. There were some interesting connections, though, with Poe's backstory. Like, you got a lot of him remembering the first time he met Leia, and then the connections with Leia and Poe's parents as they developed in Shattered Empire, if anyone's read that comic. And then also, too, the story where Poe's mother and Luke rescue the Force-sensitive tree. If you've read Shattered Empire, you know what I'm talking about. So those connections were definitely interesting. I really just wish we got that scene where things kind of got a little bit more human for Poe. But nonetheless, there's not too much to say about Poe either. Even with Kylo, I don't have too much. I really want to get to Snoke, but just quickly with Kylo, one of the really interesting aspects is, oh man, the scene, I love the scene where Kylo first goes before Snoke, and as good as it was in the movie, I enjoyed it. It was even better in the novelization because you could see just how furious it was making Kylo. But the interesting aspect is when he comes back, having just been defeated by Rey, some seamless random person, Snoke says that Kylo was unbalanced when he lost to Rey. Like he was too much thoughts going to the light and dark and bouncing around, and he just didn't have control of either, which is really fascinating because in the novel Dark Lord, The Rise of Darth Vader, that's basically very similar to what Palpatine thought about Vader when he lost to Obi-Wan on Mustafar. He thought that Vader was between two worlds and was unbalanced between the light and dark. So when I heard Snoke say that, I thought that that was just a really cool connection to Vader. Now, just in terms, one of the things that I went into the novelization hoping for was just an idea of the whole question on whether Kylo is going to be redeemed. I don't think we know or not at this point, too, from anything specific from the novelization. But more important, perhaps, would have been the idea of why Luke was so certain that he couldn't save Kylo, having been the person that saved Darth Vader, for crying out loud. Like, it never registered with me or where it was sitting with Luke on just the whole idea on why Kylo was so irredeemable to him. But you did get a sense of, in their confrontation on Crate, why he couldn't save Kylo. And the way that it was described by Jason Fry, I thought was really, really well done. It basically, when Luke looks upon Kylo, he sees Ben Solo at the center, yes. So I did really like the fact that Luke recognized that Ben wasn't gone. Like, he didn't destroy Ben Solo, but he did say that the Ben Solo at the center of Kylo was around the shell like shell of emotion, which is a really good description too, as created by Kylo. And the way that Luke looked upon it, was the shell of emotion was impenetrable for him. So I guess there was something that Luke saw, like Luke looking upon Vader saw that there was Anakin still at the core. And yes, there was the shell created by Darth Vader, but he saw the Vader shell, I guess, as penetrable in some sense, whereas Kylo was just like a fuming individual, just raw emotion that Luke just looked upon and just gave up and thought that he couldn't get to. So I think that was, again, it's one of those things that's interesting from the novelization that you wouldn't get from the movie. I thought that it depicted Kylo a lot better in the novelization in that sense of just what was going on with him at that point too in the movie. But as Luke looked upon him, the quote is, it was beyond his powers. So he couldn't get through to whatever Ben Solo existed, which I think is interesting enough. It did connect well too, because Leia does come to that conclusion that her son is gone. And even Rey, I think, had given up on the whole redemption arc for Kylo. So there was that. I thought that it was interesting, just in the sense that we got something that alluded to why Luke was so strong in the belief he couldn't save Kylo, because I'd been wondering that quite a bit, having seen the movie. But just lastly, I will just mention too something fun that we found out, just in the sense of why Kylo wasn't killed by Chewbacca's bowcaster. It did make note, Jason Fry got it in there, that Kylo did use the Force to contain the energy of the blaster bolt. So I like that as well. Like I said too at the beginning, we did get some interesting information coming out of the novel. So nothing too interesting from Kylo, but I think that perhaps there are some things we can apply down the road, just in the sense of why he may or may not be redeemable in Episode 9. But one of the really great aspects of this novel is all of the information that we got to learn about Supreme Leader Snoke. And it's one of these situations where, did we get close to everything that I wanted? Definitely not. It's still one of these characters where there's so many questions over just who this guy is, where he comes from. And in some regards, we did get a little bit of that. So they might be working on a Snoke trilogy for all I know at this point, maybe like a novel trilogy, or even just like one novel that tells the story of Snoke, which I think would be absolutely amazing. But right now I have to say that as much as I was thinking about the Luke and Acto and Rey connection, the Snoke information that we got, and then like what it all means, is probably the most fascinating part at this point in regards for the sequel trilogy. Specifically coming out of this novelization. So we didn't get everything that we wanted, and there's still so much to know, but everything that we did get, it was way more than I thought, and I think that it's all really good. So let's jump into that. We get some great internal monologues, just in the sense of learning how Snoke, in some ways, like we don't get the full picture, but we get the bare skeleton of the story. So we know that after the Battle of Jakku, the Imperial Remnant escape into the unknown region. But what we learn is actually pretty amazing. You kind of can assume all of this, but it is great that it's actually set out in the novelization. So as part of Palpatine's contingency, the Imperial Remnant goes into the unknown regions, basically because Palpatine was preparing for the contingency and was forging paths and hyperspace routes into the unknown regions through the help of Thrawn, I should mention as well. So it does go into the contingency and how that emerged and came to fruition through the Aftermath trilogy. But it's mentioned in this novelization that despite the contingency plans and all of the Imperial Remnant's military preparations, and it does mention that they set up shipyards and military installations and bases in the unknown regions. So I love that. But despite all of Palpatine's plans and his preparations for the contingency, the novelization states that it wasn't sufficient to meet the terrors in the unknown region. And the Imperial Remnant was almost destroyed, which, first of all, is awesome because that's an excellent connection to the Thrawn novel, wherein Thrawn is really worried about these terrors in the unknown regions as well, which is the whole basis for his alliance with the Empire. So that's excellent. And gosh, I have to say, just as a bit of an aside, I really want that story. I you know that there's something that went on in these interceding years between Episode 6 and Episode 7 that happened just in the unknown regions itself. Like, even as much as information from the known galaxy would be cool to have, The unknown regions information is probably very high on my list at this point as well. And I have to wonder too, as we'll get to it, because the Imperial Remnant was almost destroyed, it was actually Snoke who saved the Imperial Remnant. And we don't know how exactly. I'm dying to know how. And it says that something to the effect that they either destroyed or eliminated the kingdoms of the unknown regions. Like, does that include the Chiss Ascendancy? There's just so much to be decided still at this point. But nonetheless, we learned from the novel that the Imperial Remnant is almost destroyed in the unknown regions, which again would evolve into the First Order. And it's Snoke who saved them. And it wasn't Snoke saving them through some military that he has, or his military prowess. The novelization says that it was through his knowledge. And this is where it gets really interesting. Again, do we know what knowledge it is? No, unfortunately not. So that's something that we need to find out at some point too. But really, the interesting aspect to this whole knowledge component of Snoke is it's something that Sidious wanted. So Sidious's plan for the contingency was to get the Imperial Remnant to grow within the unknown regions. That was more his political Emperor Palpatine side of things, but he was also forging hyperspace routes into the unknown regions, not just to let the Remnant grow if he was to ever die, but also because he had a pull towards the unknown regions. He felt that there was something out there, and I think people are familiar with that too from the Aftermath series. There's been quite a bit of videos, at least I've seen, where people are speculating that perhaps there's this like dark side pull, which may be Snoke, but I don't think it is Snoke. The novel seems that it's something other than Snoke itself. The novel states that Snoke saved the Imperial Remnant through his knowledge, and Sidious was after this knowledge. So basically, Snoke alludes to the fact, and it's not done with Snoke actually saying this, but it's in the scenes from developed around Snoke. But basically, Sidious knew that the galaxy's knowledge of the Force came from long-abandoned half-legendary star systems, and Sidious knew that these great truths awaited discovery within the unknown regions. So that's some really good stuff as well. So Snoke knows that, one, Sidious, like Palpatine, is also a Sith. He knows that he's the heir to the Sith as Sidious, and he knows that he also wants to find and discover these great truths within the unknown region. Well, the thing is, Snoke already knows those great truths. So he's one step ahead of Palpatine in that respect. And again, we don't know what the great truths are, unfortunately, or what knowledge he had, but it does tie into the whole wise label that Kylo gave Snoke, and really does set himself apart from as powerful dark side users, I would imagine as well. So again, we don't know exactly what the story of Snoke is, how exactly he arose to become Supreme Leader, but we do know that, one, the Imperial Remnant that would become the First Order is almost destroyed within the unknown regions. Snoke saves the Imperial Remnant, not through any military means, but through his knowledge of the Force, I would assume, that was laying hidden in the unknown regions that Sidious wanted. So these are all just, again, they're answers that lead to more questions. So it's a bit frustrating in that sense. But again, that's really interesting information about Snoke. And just in terms of the whole great truths within the unknown regions, that's why I'm putting so much stock into Acto. Again, one of these great truths being discovered upon Acto by Luke. But nonetheless, I thought that was extremely interesting. But we also learned too just how Snoke was able to almost keep an eye on Luke for the entire time, but then more importantly, how he got involved to turn Kylo and really affect Luke. We learned that Snoke knew that Luke was not only extremely powerful, but he knew that both Anakin and Luke were the favored instrument of the cosmic force, and thus, after episode 6, he, his intent was to watch Luke very carefully. So at first it says that he didn't fear Luke because he wasn't trying to rebuild the Jedi Order, which Snoke saw as actually a very smart path for Luke to have done, because Snoke didn't have a very high view of the Jedi Order at the time either. But the thing is Luke started to threaten Snoke when he started his designs to rebuild the Jedi Order. So at that point, Snoke had to intervene. And what he did was he used, again, it's just a reference to this knowledge. I'm doing in air quotes. We don't know what it is, but he used his vast stores of knowledge to confuse Luke and then to also turn Ben Solo against him. So again, that's just really interesting stuff as well. Just in the sense that like the whole scene with Luke and Ben Solo really is driven by Snoke too, and really again alludes to just this power base, or this not power base, this knowledge base that Snoke has, which we don't know what it is yet, but again too, it really is. It's a bit unfortunate that Snoke seems to be gone at this point, because there's so much more I would like to learn about Snoke, but the stuff that we have from this novelization, I have to admit, is way more than I thought that we were going to get. And really, even though it gives more questions than answers, I think that it's all really good and sets something up that's going to be a very interesting Snoke story in the future. So the last thing I just want to say about Snoke is, again, just like I had a question that lingered on why perhaps Luke saw Kylo as someone who was irredeemable, I also had this question on why exactly Snoke, if he has all of this knowledge and is so wise, something that comes across in the movie as well, why doesn't he see Kylo's betrayal coming? And it's really pinpointed. It's really well done. Again, this will have to be explored more in an upcoming video as well. But I think that really it just boils down to him underestimating Kylo. Like, he was really at his like wit's end with Kylo after what happened on Starkiller Base. But it was also not just underestimating him too, but he did misinterpret, which happens again, Snoke not being a Sith, but we've seen, masters do this to their apprentices all the time. Plagueis and Sidious comes to mind very quickly, but he just misinterpreted the dance of light and dark within Kylo. He thought that, going back to the term of unbalanced for Kylo, like he saw that Kylo was unbalanced after Starkiller Base, but when Snoke is about to kill Rey, he sees that there's a calm within Kylo, and he sees that there is almost a balance of light and dark within him. And just Snoke interprets that as him coming to peace, that he has to kill Rey. And he doesn't see it that Kylo has come to the conclusion that he's going to kill Snoke. So in a lot of ways, it's just him really. He wanted a Vader, yes, but really his turning Ben against Luke was more to confuse Luke and to stop Luke's design as the Jedi Order. So as much as he wanted Kylo to potentially get a powerful Vader-like apprentice, it was really more to hinder Luke. And then I just think that he just misinterpreted him. There's a great quote where he says that he knew Kylo had potential, but he didn't believe he had the means to use power to change his destiny. So I don't think he was ever of the mind that Kylo had this great destiny before him, and I think that he really just thought that he had gotten as far as he was going to get to Kylo. So those are parts of the novelization as well. I thought that they were interesting enough, but again, too, those will have to probably be explored a bit more in videos down the road. But nonetheless, in my opinion, we got way more than anything I was expecting for Snoke, and in my opinion, it was all pretty much good as well. And then lastly, I just want to touch a bit on one of my personal favorites, Armitage Hux. So I think in the novelization, Hux is much better than in the film. I've been pretty vocal about my disappointment with Hux in the film, just because I thought that we were going to get like this great antagonist, potentially somebody who could not go toe-to-toe with Kylo in the sense of like actual combat, but just in this military mind that, potentially threatened the entire galaxy, but then also was like somebody who could, be a good foil to Kylo in the end. I was disappointed that he was used a bit more as comic relief. There's definitely that, again, too, the novelization's not a retelling of the movie, but it does come across better in the novelization that I found. There's a great line where, as he approaches the evacuation of the Resistance base, the novelization says something like he immediately assesses and catalogs the Resistance warships, drawing on years of training. Like, that's just good. It gives him some skills, and he's not a Thrawn, no, and he definitely doesn't have to be. He doesn't have to be a Tarkin or anyone like that. But I think that the strength of the First Order is in its leadership. And if we have this conflicted character in Kylo, it would be nice to see a really strong Hux. That's in my opinion. But you do get at multiple points, and this follows extremely well from episode 7 and kind of how I wanted it to be displayed for Hux in episode 8. But his aim is to rule the galaxy through the technological terrors that he designs. It's almost like the whole time that it was bringing this up in the novelization, I could only think of like Tarkin Doctrine 2.0, just wanting to rule the galaxy through fear, through huge warships and super weapons. And really, as scary as the Tarkin Doctrine was and how intense like Grand Moff Tarkin was, at a lot of times when you get Hux's point of view in the novelization, it makes him even more fearful. Like he had some really insane designs for the galaxy at large, even in comparison to Tarkin and his doctrine. Like there's at one point where he, sets out an intention to create hundreds of Star Killers. So I do like that. I do like Hux as the madman who has some skills other than just the madman who's more of a comic relief type of character. I would say that Hux is much better in the novelization. The other thing that I really liked about Hux is I like him too as a First Order sycophant, somebody who's like really determined, who grew up with the First Order, who grew up hearing the stories about the Empire and wants something to more out of the First Order. But there was a great quote in the novelization as well, where it said something to the effect of, Hux doesn't want the First Order to be an Empire 2.0. He sees the First Order that was the ultimate fulfillment of something that the Empire never was. So he wants it to be something more than the Empire, which was ultimately the removal of all weakness. Which, again, from a guy who does have his own weaknesses, that is Hux, it's an interesting perspective to have, but still one that I think is interesting for that character. I mean, after that speech in 7, you want that character to be, in my opinion, how he was depicted in the novelization. Just somebody who wanted to rule the galaxy and blow up as many planets as he had to do it. So I do think that Hux is much better in the novel. I have to say too, it doesn't mean that he has no weaknesses, because some of my favorite scenes in the movie and the novelization, they're very close, but they're my favorites for the similar reasons, because they're just so well done. Like the scenes with Hux and some of the older Imperial officers like Peavy, Kennedy, Yago, I think one of them was. They have absolutely no respect for Hux, and in a lot of ways he's kind of viewed as like the CEO's son by those officers coming out of the former Galactic Empire. But anyway, those scenes were great in the novelization as well. And I just think overall Hux was much better in the novelization. Lastly, I just want to talk about the First Order in general, because I have been pretty vocal about my disappointment that we haven't had the opportunity to learn more about the First Order. We've gotten only very narrow windows into what exactly the First Order is, not just really from their a philosophical question, like what do they want, what's their ideology, where are they going, that type of thing, but also just their military prowess. We know from the guides that they're not the Empire. They don't have the means to deploy 10,000 Star Destroyers across the galaxy. But even in the novel, the novel just creates so many more questions in this regard for me. I wish that in episode 8, there was some scenes where we saw just exactly how large the First Order was and what they were capable in terms of emerging from the unknown regions and really trying to establish dominance over the entire galaxy. Again, the windows we've had into the First Order are so narrow at this point that it just seems like they've lost Starkiller, they've lost the Supremacy, they've lost a countless number of Star Destroyers and Dreadnoughts, which of course isn't their entire arsenal, but in my estimation, that's 2 super weapons. But nonetheless, in the novelization, there's a scene where Hux concludes, yes, we've lost Starkiller, yes, we've lost the Supremacy, But that's not going to stop us. We're still going to take over the galaxy. The New Republic is gone, and the Resistance, which is only 3 ships, which is like what I just don't get at this point in their head-to-head battle. I get that they're worried about the Resistance starting a spark of rebellion against them and turning into something grander, but like Hux looks at all that and isn't fazed at all, and I want to know why he's not fazed. Like what else is out there that the First Order has that we don't know what they're doing? It says that they've controlled sectors in the Outer Rim. I just wish that we had some reference of the weight that the First Order had behind them, because they do. I want them to be like a Juggernaut in some respects, a scary force that people are just turning to, which it does seem in the novel and in the movie, of course. Like people are fed up with the New Republic and maybe are leaning more towards the First Order. You do get that sense. I just wish that we knew what exactly the extent of the First Order was and why people would be so willing to turn to them. But nonetheless, I think that Hux was better overall in the novelization. The First Order, again, too, just in the sense that they talk about dismantling or destroying many of the kingdoms in the unknown regions. That story I want. And I want to know if that includes the Chiss Ascendancy and whether or not Thrawn's involved. I think that would be great. But just all these stories that we get about the First Order successes, like we see none of that in the movies. So it would be nice to know a little bit more about the First Order. I almost wish that in Episode 9, we emerge like 5 years later after Episode 8, and the First Order is this juggernaut that it appears to be and does have seemingly control over the galaxy. I think that would be a good way to tell the story from there. But nonetheless, we'll have to see about that. But let's stop there for our review and discussion of Star Wars The Last Jedi by Jason Fry. Like I said at the beginning of the review, I really enjoyed this. I mean, in a lot of ways, I love the novelization, and I would recommend it. Really, I mean, if you didn't enjoy Episode 8, this isn't going to save the movie for you, certainly not. But if you're kind of like me and you enjoy a lot of the lore aspects and some of the more in-depth material that you can go in for with a novelization, if you're just a fan of novelizations in general, this one is great. I think that the deleted scenes are all very interesting. We could talk a lot more about some of these things, but this one, the review is a little bit longer than I anticipated, which is only natural because it's our first one back and we're tackling a book that's so interesting at this point. I have heard from people too, though, that they prefer longer book reviews and discussions just because they like something that they can just throw on and listen to. So I hope it helps in that regard. But we'll stop there. Again, I just want to say congratulations to our 3 winners of a hardcover copy of the novelization, Hunter Y, Michael, and Ben. Again, I'll be sending messages out tonight to the 3 of you, so be on the lookout for that. If you want to participate in this week's giveaway, which will be again Star Wars Lando, the 2015 canon comic, just be on the lookout for a question at the beginning of 2 videos before this Sunday. I'll throw out a question. All you have to do is answer it in the comment section below, and you'll be all good to go to win a copy, potentially, for our giveaway next week of Star Wars Lando. Again, we'll have 3 copies, one for the entire audience of Star Wars Reading Club, and then there'll be 2 Patreon copies next week. But thank you very much again, everyone, for your support and all the comments that I know that you guys are going to leave in the comment section below, because I can't wait to hear what you guys thought about the novelization and maybe potentially some of the ideas in the review here. I can't wait. I'll jump into the discussion as well, so I look forward to that. Like I said at the beginning as well, I'm very happy to get back into longer reviews of the print materials, novels and comics here on the channel, and I think it's going to be a great time for the rest of the year. But thank you very much for listening to this review of Star Wars The Last Jedi, the Episode 8 novelization. I hope that you guys all have a great day, and I'll see you at next week's review, which will take place next Monday. Have a great day, everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.